In the spring of 1884, in the dry country south of Prescott in the Arizona Territory, a man named Wade Carver paid $11 to a justice of the peace to marry a woman he had spoken to for less than an hour. He did it to keep her from being put off a train at Maricopa with no money and no name anyone would vouch for. And he told himself, all the way back to his quarter section of hard ground, that it was a kindness and nothing more. He had decided what she was before she said a word. A woman traveling alone with a carpetbag and a bruise going yellow under one eye was a woman in trouble, and a woman in trouble would need looking after, and Wade was a man who looked after things because he did not know how to do anything else. What he did not yet understand, riding home with a stranger on the wagon seat beside him and the saguaros throwing long shadows across the road, was that he was the one who had been drowning for 3 years, and that the woman he thought he was rescuing had just reached down and taken hold of his wrist. If you have ever been certain you knew which of two people needed saving, stay with this one. By the end you will see how wrong a careful man can be, and how gently the truth can correct him. Her name was Esther Lowe, and she had come west on a ticket bought with the last of her wages, running from a husband in a hard-scrabble town outside Hannibal in Missouri, who had not deserved the name. She had been married to Floyd Lowe at 17, and had spent 8 years learning the particular weather of a man who was charming in company, and something else behind a closed door, and the bruise going yellow under her eye was the last sentence in a conversation she had decided to end by walking to the depot in the dark with a carpetbag and the ticket money sewn into the hem of her skirt. She had ridden as far as the money would carry her, which was Maricopa, and there the conductor had wanted to see a fare she could not pay for the last leg, and a man she did not know had stepped up to the window and paid it, and then, when the trouble did not end there, had married her at the justice's office so that no one could send her back to a name that wanted her. Wade did not ask her any of this. He had learned not to ask. His own losses had taught him that questions only made a person say out loud the thing they were trying to keep from looking at, and so he gave her the wagon seat and the silence and the long road north past the saguaros and the broken country. And he thought he was being decent. He was being decent. He was also being a coward, and the two things looked very much alike from the outside, and it would take her the better part of a year to teach him the difference. They stopped once on that first road home, at a roadside well where Wade watered Job and the Jenny, and Esther got down without being asked and worked the handle and filled the trough. And Wade watched her do it and revised, without knowing he was doing it, the first sentence he had written about her in his head. A woman in trouble, he had thought. He had not thought to add that she knew how to work a well handle without being shown, and that she did it the way a person does a thing they have done 10,000 times, and that there was nothing helpless in her at all. The land Wade farmed was 40 acres of grudging soil broken by an old creek that ran in March and not in August. There was a house of adobe and ocotillo ribs that his father had raised in 1871, and that Wade had patched and repatched until it was more his work than his father's. There was a barn with a sound roof and a leaning wall. There were 2 mules, Job and a younger Jenny he had not bothered to name, a milk cow, a flock of leghorns, and a black and white dog named Pim, who slept across the threshold and counted himself the third party to every decision made in that house. 3 years before, there had been a wife. Her name had been Caroline, and the fever had taken her in a single week in the autumn of 1881, and Wade had buried her on the low-rise east of the house where the soil was deepest, and he had not gone up there since except to pull the weeds that wanted to claim the marker. He told the new wife none of this. She found the grave herself, the third morning, walking out to learn the shape of the place that was now hers, and she stood a long while reading the one name and the 2 dates cut into the soft stone, and she said nothing about it at supper. That evening, Wade noticed that the wildflowers which had been choking the foot of the marker were gone, pulled clean, laid in a small bundle on the sill of the window that faced the rise. He did not mention it. Neither did she. It was the first thing she ever told him without speaking, and he was slow, and it would be months before he understood she had been telling him things that way the whole time. The first weeks were a careful arithmetic of strangers. They divided the house without a word said. She took the room that had been Caroline's sewing corner and hung a quilt across the doorway, and Wade kept the main room and the cot near the stove where he had been sleeping anyway since the fever year. They ate at the same table and did not look at each other while they did it. He told her, the first night in the flat voice of a man reciting terms, that he expected nothing of her, that the marriage was paper and the paper was for her protection, and that when she had her feet under her she was free to go and he would not stop her or hold the $11 against her. He thought he was offering her freedom. What he was offering her, though neither of them had the words for it then, was a locked door with the key set politely on her side of it, and a man on the other side who had decided in advance that everyone he let close would leave or die, and who had built his whole quiet life around making the leaving easy. Esther did not leave. She did the opposite, slowly, the way water finds the low places in a field. She found the broom and used it. She found the dough trough cracked and dry and soaked it back to use and set bread rising on the warm shelf above the stove, and the smell of it filled the adobe house for the first time in 3 years. And Wade came in from the south fence and stopped in the doorway with the dust still on him and did not know why his chest had gone tight. She did not look up from the dough. She said the flour was near out and they would need more before the month turned, and he said he would ride to Prescott Friday, and that was the whole of it, and it was the longest conversation they had managed yet. He rode to Prescott on Friday, the better part of a day each way, and he bought the flour and the salt, and then at the dry goods counter he stood a long moment over a paper of fine sewing needles she had not asked for, because he had seen her the night before squinting over a torn shirt by the low lamp and mending it with a needle gone brown with rust that fought her at every stitch. He bought the needles. He bought a card of thread to go with them, and then, because he was already past the line he had drawn for himself, a small tin of good tea, because he had noticed she drank the Bitter Creek water coffee without complaint, and he had decided without examining the decision that she should not have to. He did not say any of it was for her. He set the paper and the thread and the tin on the table where she would find them and went out to see to the mules, with the particular gruffness of a man who has just done a soft thing and does not want it looked at. When he came back and the torn shirt was mended and folded square on his cot, the stitches small and even and nothing like his own crude work, and beside it lay a second shirt of his. One he had not known had a hole worn through the elbow, mended too. The tea tin had been opened and a pot stood warm on the stove and 2 cups were set out, his on the side of the table where he always sat. They were not speaking of any of it. They were speaking through all of it, and the language was work and small-bought things and a cup set down on the right side of the table. And Wade Carver, who had spent 3 years believing he had nothing left anyone would want, was beginning, without once admitting it to himself, to learn to read. The valley had opinions. It always did. The nearest neighbor was a widow and son named Hollis, 2 miles east, and beyond them the small dusty knot of a town called Dunmore, that was a feed store, a church, a saloon, and a scatter of houses pretending to be a street. Word had gone around that Carver had brought home a wife off the train, a stranger nobody knew, and the word carried the particular weight that a small place reserves for a woman whose history it cannot inspect. The preacher's wife called once and stayed 20 minutes and asked questions shaped like kindness with hooks inside them. Esther answered every one of them plainly and told her nothing, and the preacher's wife went home unsatisfied and told 3 people that the new Mrs. Carver was close, which in that country was not a compliment. Esther heard the word come back to her within the week, the way such words always come back in a small place, carried by a neighbor who framed it as a warning for her own good. She did not defend herself. She did not ride to the church to set anyone straight. She baked an extra loaf the next Sunday and a pan of beans with the last of the salt pork, and she walked the 2 miles east to the Hollis place because she had heard, in the same gust of talk that carried the word close to her, that the widow Hollis was down sick and alone with a boy too young to nurse her. She found the door shut and the boy Tom, who was 9 and trying very hard to be older, sitting on the step with a cold biscuit he had been making last for 3 days, and inside the widow, Marin Hollis, burning with a quinsy throat swelled near shut, unable to swallow, frightened, and too proud to send for help. Esther got the fire going and got water boiling and got broth thin enough to slide down the swollen throat a spoonful at a time, and she stayed the whole day and into the dark. And when the worst of the swelling had broken and the woman could speak, she gripped Esther's wrist and asked her name, and Esther told her, and the widow said she had heard talk that the new Carver wife was cold. Esther said she had heard the same, and the 2 women looked at each other, and something passed between them that does not need a word, and the widow Hollis laughed, which hurt her throat, and from that day forward she was Esther's first and fiercest friend, and would hear nothing said against her in her hearing. Esther came home after full dark and did not tell Wade where she had been. He found out 2 days later from Tom Hollis himself, who turned up at the Carver fence on no errand at all except to look at the woman who had fed him, and who announced to Wade with the terrible flat honesty of 9 years old that Mrs. Carver was the best cook in the whole entire world, and that his ma had cried when she left and said God had sent her down the road. Wade looked across the yard to where his wife was hanging wash on the line, her sleeves turned back and a wooden pin in her teeth. And something in the careful arithmetic he had been doing all those weeks came up with a different sum than the one he had set out to prove, and he turned away and busied himself with the gate latch before she could catch the look on his face. Now here is a thing worth pausing on, because it is the hinge the whole story turns upon, and it is easy to ride past it in the dust of all the small days. Wade Carver believed he had married a woman who needed saving. He had built the entire structure of his decency on that belief. It let him be kind without being known. It let him give without risking the one thing he could not afford to lose again, which was the inside of himself, the soft, ruined place where Caroline had been. As long as Esther was the rescued one, Wade was safe. The terrible mathematics of grief had made him generous in exactly the way that cost him nothing. And Esther, who had spent 8 years married to a man who used her need against her, saw the shape of Wade's kindness for what it was almost at once, and she did not resent it because she understood it. She had built rooms like that in herself. She simply, patiently, day by day, declined to live in the one he had built for her. Summer came hard that year. The creek went to a thread by the middle of June and then to a dark, damp line of stones, and the corn Wade had put in stood pale and curling at the leaf edges, and he was out before light and in after dark, fighting water up from the well to the rows by the bucket, 2 buckets to a yoke across his shoulders, up the slope and down the rows and back, a losing fight against 40 acres and a sky that had forgotten how to rain, and both of them knew it was losing. On the 3rd morning of it, Esther came out to the well with her sleeves turned back and her skirt hitched and tied at the knee, and a second yoke she had found hanging in the barn. And she did not ask if she could help, and she did not frame it as helping. She set the yoke on her own shoulders and drew and carried beside him, row for row, bucket for bucket, from gray light to full dark, and by the 2nd day the rope had worn her palms to blisters, and the blisters had broken, and she was bleeding into the hemp and saying nothing about it. Wade saw the blood on the rope and told her to go in and see to her hands. She looked at him with an expression he was coming to know and would know for 50 years, level and unhurried and entirely immovable. And she said that the corn did not care whose hands were on the bucket, and neither, just at present, did she. He did not argue. He had learned already that arguing with that look was like arguing with the well itself. They drew water until the moon came up, and they saved perhaps half the crop, which was enough to matter and not enough to ever forget, and somewhere in that long month of shared water and shared blistered hands and shared failure, the silence between them changed its whole character. It was no longer the silence of two strangers being careful with each other. It had become the silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them, which is a different thing and a far more dangerous one. And Wade lay on his cot at night with the door thrown open to the heat and Pym breathing slow across the threshold. And he was afraid in a way he had not let himself be afraid since the fever year, because he had caught himself that afternoon at the well, watching her draw water with her ruined hands, wanting her to stay. He had not let himself want anything to stay in 3 years. Wanting, in his accounting, was only the bill that arrived before the loss. The biographical truth of Wade Carver, the thing he had told no one and least of all his wife, was that he had not simply lost Caroline to the fever. He had lost his nerve. When the sickness came through the valley in that autumn of 1881, it had taken Caroline and it had reached for him too, and for 9 days he had lain in his own sweat, certain he was dying, and he had not died. And Caroline had, and the unbearable arithmetic of that he had lived and she had not, had broken something in him that the burying did not mend. He had decided, in the long flat years after, that the safest life was one in which nothing was loved hard enough to be missed. He farmed 40 acres and fed 2 mules and a cow and a dog, and he kept the marker clean, and he asked nothing of the world, and gave it back exactly that. He had married Esther because rescuing her was a way of being good that did not require him to risk being known. And he was, by the high summer of that year, in the worst trouble of his careful life, because she had walked straight through the locked door he had built and was standing in the soft ruined room and had not flinched. She learned the truth of his nerve by accident, the way she learned most true things about him, through work and not through words. There was an evening late in August when a dry storm came up over the western hills, all wind and white lightning and not a drop of rain in it, and a strike took the old cottonwood that leaned over the dry creek and split it down the heart and laid a burning limb across the brittle grass at the edge of Wade's south field, where the half-saved corn still stood. He saw the glow from the yard, and he ran for it, and Esther, coming out at the sound of the strike, saw him run, and saw in the next white flicker of the lightning that he had stopped. He had stopped a full 20 feet from the flame and stood there with the shovel useless in his hand, shaking, unable to make his legs carry him the last 20 feet into the heat and the smoke. And she understood in that one stopped instant something about her husband that he had never once been able to put into words. She did not stop to be gentle about it. There was a field of corn behind that fire and a winter on the other side of the corn. She snatched the wet sacking off the rain barrel and took up the second shovel from the barn wall, and she went past him, past where he stood frozen, straight into the smoke, and she beat the line of fire with the wet sacking and threw shovelfuls of dirt across the burning grass and beat it again where it tried to crawl, the heat curling the loose hair against her face. And after a long moment he was beside her, ashamed and silent and working, shovel and sacking, the two of them, until between them they had killed the fire in the grass before it ever reached the standing corn. When it was out, they sat down in the black, smoking grass with their faces streaked and their lungs raw and their hands gone numb from the shovels, and she did not say one word about the 20 feet where he had stood and could not move. She reached over in the dark and laid her bleeding, blistered hand across his shaking one, and she held it there, saying nothing, until the shaking had run all the way out of him and stopped. That was all. They did not speak. They did not need to. Whatever the marriage had been on the $11 paper, it became something else entirely in the burned grass that night, and neither of them was fool enough to say the name of it out loud and risk it in the saying. The valley's doubt did not vanish all at once. It simply found nothing more to feed on, and grew quiet, the way doubt does when it is starved of fresh incident. Maren Hollis recovered her voice and used a good deal of it, telling the preacher's wife to mind her own kitchen and leave the Carver woman be. Tom Hollis took to coming over every Saturday he could manage, ostensibly to be useful and actually to trail after Wade and ask 10,000 questions about mules and fence wire and whether a man could rope a jackrabbit if he was quick enough. And Wade, who had not had a child near him since he had been one himself on that same hard ground, found to his own surprise that he did not mind the boy at all, that the steady chatter filled a silence in the place he had not known was sore until something began to fill it. One Saturday in the cool of October, the man and the borrowed boy set to mending the leaning wall of the barn, the one Wade had been meaning to get to for 3 years, and they jacked it plumb and set new posts deeper than the old ones and braced it true, and Tom drove nails with enormous seriousness and only bent half of them. Esther stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them work in the slanting light, the tall, quiet man and the small, loud boy, and she thought, though she did not say it, that a person could build a whole good life out of borrowed pieces if they were only willing to stop guarding so fiercely the few pieces they had left. She did not say it out loud. She put it in the supper instead, a better supper than the day called for, and Wade noticed because by then he noticed everything she did and most of what she did not. The autumn brought the reckoning, and it came, as the worst things in that country always came, in the form of weather and debt arriving at the same door. Wade owed $40 to Abner Pratt's feed store in Dunmore, carried on credit through the hard, dry summer against seed and salt and the wire he had strung in the spring, and the note fell due at the turn of the year. The half-crop would not cover it, and still leave enough behind to winter 2 people in the stock, and Wade had begun to do the grim arithmetic of which animal he would have to sell when the second week of November came down out of the high country with the first true cold, and the milk cow went down sick in her stall, off her feed and dull-eyed, and Wade was up 2 nights running with her, and on the 3rd morning he came in gray with no sleep to find Esther moving slow at the stove and trying to hide it. She had taken a chill she would not admit to. By that evening she could not hide it any longer, and by the next morning it had gone down into her chest and become the deep lung fever that the whole valley dreaded going into winter. The same fever in every particular that had carried Caroline out of that house in a single week 3 autumns before. Wade knew the signs the way a man knows the face of the thing that ruined him once, and has waited at the edge of his sleep every night since to come back and finish the work. The doctor was in Prescott, a full day's hard ride each way over country already going to ice, and the sky to the north had gone the flat, dead-iron color that means heavy snow is coming down to the passes. And Esther lay behind the hung quilt in Caroline's old room, burning and coughing and growing thinner and weaker by the hour, and Wade Carver stood in the doorway of his own house and felt the old terror rise up out of the floor to swallow him whole. He had stood frozen 20 feet from a fire. He had spent 3 years arranging his life so that he would never again be in the room where someone he loved was dying. And here was the room, and here was the dying, and here was the woman, and the whole structure of his careful cowardice came down around him in a single breath. He did not ride for the doctor. There was no time, and he knew it. A day there and a day back was 2 days she might not have. He did what the fever year had taught him and what he had spent 3 years refusing to do again, which was to stay in the room. He built the fire up and kept it roaring against the cold. He broke the ice on the rain barrel and brought cool cloths for the heat of her and changed them through the night as the fever climbed. He got broth from the bones of the slaughtered leghorns down her throat, a spoon at a time when she could not lift her head. When the cough tore at her, he held her up against his chest so she could breathe, and he talked to her all the long night, more words than he had said to any living soul in 3 years, telling her about Caroline and the 9 days and the shame of living, telling her the whole locked inside of himself in the dark because he was certain she could not hear him, and it was the only way he had ever learned to say true things, to a person who could not answer. The snow came down out of the high country on the second night and shut the passes and shut the road to Prescott and shut the two of them into the small bright room with the fire, and the fever broke just before dawn of the third day. It broke the way those fevers break, all at once, a great drenching sweat, and then a stillness so complete that for one stopped heartbeat, Wade thought it had gone the other way, thought he had lost again, and he bent over her with his whole life held in his throat. And then she breathed, a long, easy, rattle-free breath, and her eyes came open, clear, and found his face hanging over hers, gray and unshaven and ruined with 3 nights of no sleep. And she looked at him a long moment, and what she said was not grand. She said his name, just his name, in a voice scraped to nothing, the first time she'd ever said it. And then she said that she had heard him, every word, all 3 nights. She had not been as far gone as he thought. She had heard him tell the dark about Caroline and the shame, and she wanted him to know that a man who stays in the room is not a coward, whatever he had decided about himself at 20 feet from a fire, and that she had stopped running the day she found his wife's grave weeded clean, because a man who tends a grave that carefully is a man who knows how to love something, even if he has forgotten he knows it. He did not answer her with a speech. He was not built for speeches, and the moment did not want one. He took her ruined cold hand in his 2 ruined ones, and he warmed it finger by finger, the way she had warmed his in the burned grass, and he stayed bent over her holding her hand while the fire cracked and the snow came down silent past the window, and Pim climbed up onto the foot of the bed where he had never once been allowed, and no one told him to get down. The doctor never did come. By the time the passes opened, she was sitting up and taking solid food and scolding him for not sleeping, and the cow had pulled through on her own in the stall, and the only true casualty of the whole hard-frozen week was the last of Wade Carver's belief that he had been the one doing the saving. He paid the $40 to Abner Pratt at the feed store at the turn of the year, every last cent of it on the day it fell due, because Esther had nursed the half-crop and the leghorns in the kitchen garden through the dry summer with a thrift so fierce and so quiet that it had turned half a crop into a whole winter with a little laid by. He stood at the counter in Dunmore and counted the coins out one at a time onto the worn wood, and Pratt, who had stood in that same store the spring before and taken a friendly wager on how few months the stranger wife off the train would last, took the money and made the mark in his ledger and did not say a word about any of it. Wade did not say a word either. There was nothing to say that the paid note did not already say better. The work had spoken for both of them, the way it always had. They were married a second time in the spring, in the small whitewashed church in Dunmore, by the circuit preacher who came through the valley every 6 weeks on a tired roan. This time it was not $11 and a justice of the peace and a locked door with the key set polite on the wrong side of it. This time, Esther stood up in a dove-gray dress that Marin Hollis had helped her cut and sew through the long evenings of February, and Wade stood up in the good shirt, the one with the elbow she had mended in her first week in his house, because he had asked her particularly to let him wear that one. Tom Hollis carried the ring on a borrowed cushion, because there was no one else to do it, and he was very nearly fit to burst with the dignity of the office. And when the preacher came to the old question, the one Wade had answered the first time in a flat, dead voice reciting terms, he answered it this time in a clear and steady voice with no tremor anywhere in it. The voice of a man who had finally learned the difference between being decent and being known, and had decided after a long, hard winter of learning it that he would rather be both. They lived on that 40 acres for 51 years. Wade bought the adjoining quarter section in 1891 when the creek came back full 3 springs running, and then another, and by the turn of the century the Carver place ran cattle on better than 600 acres, and was spoken of in the county as one of the steady ones, the kind that did not boom and did not break. They had 4 children who lived. The eldest, a girl, they named Caroline, and Esther chose the name herself and would hear no argument about it. and Wade went up to the rise the day she was born and stood at the old marker a long time and came down with his face washed clean of something he had carried 11 years. The boy after her took to the land and kept it. One girl taught the Dunmore School for 30 years. The youngest went to be a doctor in Prescott, the very thing they had not been able to reach the night of the fever. And Esther said more than once when she was old that she had sent a doctor back down the road that had once had none, and that this was the truest accounting of a life she knew how to give. Tom Hollis married the schoolteacher daughter, and the two families became one in the way frontier families did, knit at the edges until you could not say where one left off. Pim lived 13 years and is buried at the foot of the rise, and there were other dogs after, but the family only ever counted the one. The valley that had called her close came around the way valleys do, one funeral and one harvest and one borrowed cup of flour at a time, until there was no one left who remembered her as a stranger, only as the woman who had fed half the county through the bad winter of '93 and never once asked who deserved it. Wade died first, in the winter of 1935, in the same room where the fever had broken 51 years before, with the fire built up against the cold, and Esther's hand in his two hands, warming it finger by finger, which was the only way either of them had ever known to say the thing too large for saying. She lived 4 years more. When asked, late, by a granddaughter writing the family down in a book, who had saved whom in that first hard year, the old woman thought about it a while, and she said that her husband had always believed he had pulled her off a train, and that she had let him believe it for 51 years because it was true, and also because the truer thing was the other way around, and he had never quite been able to bear hearing it said out loud. They lie now on the rise east of the house, the 3 markers in a row, Caroline who went first and Wade beside her and Esther beside him, and the valley spreads out below them green in the spring and gold in the fall the way it always did, and the wind off the high country still combs the grass at the foot of the stones the way her hand once combed it clean. If this one warmed you, tell me below who in your own life turned out to be saving you while you thought you were saving them. And if you have a little more evening left, stay a while. I have another story very near this one about a woman everyone in her county swore could not last a single winter alone, and how completely she proved them wrong.